pressed yes.
Okay, it's starting to record now.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 2 of Nautilus. I'm your host, Alexander Wolfheze, and with us for the second episode, we have a very special guest. This is Claire Rae Randall. For the people who have seen my shows before, she may be a familiar face because I've interviewed her before about her, in my opinion, quite brilliant book, The War on Gender, about 2 years ago. Of course, a title that has been controversial ever since. And actually, I think that's a good way to start this podcast, if you don't mind, Claire. Welcome to the show. And tell us something about what happened with your book, how it was received, and what comments did you get to it?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast, Alexander. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity because to answer your first question, when I had my book out, it's actually 3 years now, unbelievably, and it's almost 3 years since we spoke, recorded about this. Now, I was prepared because my book, The War on Gender, is I take a median position between both the transgender ideologues and the gender criticals. I disagree with both of them because, to put it simply, the gender ideologues over the last 20 years, they've taken the subject from being, when I went through my own process of gender reassignment 40 years ago, there was a high standard required. You had to, they wouldn't just give it to anybody. Unfortunately, there's been a massive mission creep since, well, about the last 20 years or so, in which it's sort of developed to the point where a lot of people are simply saying that they want to be merely able to self-identify. So basically, you don't have to go through any form of assessment or medical treatment or anything like that. They simply want to be able to say, look, this is what they call linguistic performative gender. So basically, you say something and that's what you are. Well, I don't agree with that. I wanted to be as physically female as possible because that's what I wanted ever since I was the youngest age of a child, about 4.5. The moment I became aware of my physical sex, I realized that I just wanted to be a girl instead. So anyway, so we have the gender ideology people, transgender, who want to be able to say anything, and so they want to be able to enter women's spaces even if they've had no medical reassignment. Now, on the other side, we have the gender critics, people like J.K. Rowling and Helen Joyce, who are absolutely hardcore against any form of gender reassignment whatsoever. They think that it's all just one great big political contrick. Now, what I found interesting is that hardly any of the people from either side will talk to me because I take the position which was accepted for 40 or 50 years in the latter part of the 20th century, which was that, yes, that people do have this condition of transsexualism, and this was kind of identified before the war, but obviously the war got in the way. The doctor who, oh, his name slips my slips my name. He's who was doing this research was he had to leave Germany in the early 30s, and his books and all his research was destroyed and burned. So this was picked up in the 1950s by Dr. Harry Benjamin, who got the diagnosis of transsexualism established, so that people who had this is the thing is, it's about people like myself who've had this sensation, this feeling, this belief, this unaccountable experience of feeling that you should have been in the opposite sex when you were born, and there is very little you can do about it. In fact, I would say nothing. I spent most of my 20s trying to fix myself, and it didn't work, so I went for it in my 20s. So we have, on the one hand, we have the gender ideology transgenders who say that anybody can be anything, anybody can be change their gender just by saying so without doing any physical changes. On the other side, there are the people who say that this should never be allowed to happen, that it's all just a mental illness. And anyway, so I was prepared to be virtually mobbed by both of these, because I live in Leeds, where one of the principal gender studies departments is at the university. And I some years ago, I knew quite a lot of people there, but then I realized that they had no interest in the neurological side of this, because when I was a student, I studied psychology and philosophy, and it was one of the subjects that I studied as far back as the mid-1970s when I was an undergraduate, was the potential neurodevelopmental basis for transsexualism. So this is a distinct condition apart from transgenderism, where people just want to socially role play at being a member of the opposite sex. So I was prepared to get mobbed. I was prepared to have crowds outside my front door with people maybe even throwing stones or banners, or you know what they do. Anyway, it's been quite extraordinary. I have been absolutely cancelled. I've been absolutely cancelled. I'm just completely invisible. I approach all sorts of people on social media, people who are from both sides, and I almost never get a reply. The only one who's actually approached me was Stella O'Malley, who is she's kind of the most serious, hardcore gender critic, who now I do accept that in recent years this has been, as one of the guests, Dr. Alan Francis on Stella O'Malley's recording show, said that he thought that there had been massive overdiagnosis in recent years. And to me, that's obvious, because when I went through my process 40 years ago, there were 3 people who were taking who were admitted for treatment in my year. And I think I was probably treated well, because I have certain things in my medical history that obviously I don't want to go into, but which would be indicative to a specialist on this topic that there might be something going on here, as well as the fact that I had actually qualified as an art therapist for the purpose of trying to fix myself, to stop this, to cure it. But I found, actually, after training as an art therapist and working in psychiatric nursing, I realized that this was not something that was ever going to change. I'd not had a single day in my life in which I had not had this feeling of alienation from my body, or you know, not wanting to be a girl. So eventually I gave in, and when I started going for it, it all went through very quickly and very smoothly, and I was quite surprised. But I think the doctors realized that I was a genuine case, and I knew several people at the time. Actually, I knew 2 others who started going to this clinic in Leeds, but they dropped out, and I'm quite glad that they did, actually, because it was clear to me that they really were very mixed up and didn't really have the full on gender dysphoria that I had. So it's quite strange, really, to find that the standards that were applied when I was going through my process 40 years ago are now pretty much been abandoned. Now, even the gender clinics where people such as myself were seen in the 20th century are now basically starting people on treatment almost as soon as they arrive at the clinic, with very little assessment, very little psychotherapy, very little sort of ongoing management and assessment. So it is clear to me that there is something to what the gender critics say, but the point is that they, on the one hand, they base their resistance on the fact that there are people getting treated and people who regret it and people who detransition, which is obviously an indication that they should never have gone into it in the first place. But then, unfortunately, the gender critics then go on and take this to the next level where they say, well, because there's overdiagnosis, because there are some people who regret, some people who shouldn't have done it, and so forth, that then the entire thing is wrong and people shouldn't be allowed to do it. It should be banned. In fact, that's kind of what it's got to now. This is very much a kind of cherry picking exercise because they just pick the people who, you know, when this Stella O'Malley invited me onto her podcast, I was pleased. I thought, well, this is at least a chance to get my point of view across. But she spent the entire hour and a bit trying to get me to confess that I was a sexual fetishist and that this was a sexual paraphilia. And in fact, I brushed that off and I gave her several bits of research evidence, people such as Professor Ramachandran of San Diego University, who's one of the top neuropsychologists in the world, and he gave the Reith lectures about 20 years ago. That was on the subject of language, but it does actually relate to this because he's an expert on neuro anatomy and neurobiology, and he did a study in 2007 on it was mostly female to male transsexuals, but there were some male to female transsexuals like myself involved in this study. But the main thing was that he discovered that a very high proportion of female to male transsexuals have the experience of a phantom penis. So this is like when, for instance, you're probably familiar, hopefully the listeners will be familiar with the concept of phantom limbs. The Admiral Lord Nelson, for instance, is a very famous historical figure, obviously. He had I think it was his, I'm not sure which one it was, his arm. He lost an arm in one of his naval battles, and he ever afterwards had a phantom limb there. He could feel it. He could feel it was itching. He wanted to scratch it. He couldn't do it. And he actually said that he thought this was evidence for the existence of a soul, which is an interesting concept that I might come back to if we have time. But obviously the phantom limb phenomenon is there. There's obviously some neurological structure going on, which is telling him, you know, the nerves are telling him they're still firing. So if a woman who wants to be a boy, a girl who wants to be a boy, has this sensation, this phantom limb experience when she's never even had one, but she still has this phantom experience. Now, I knew a lesbian who had this experience, and she said that if she hadn't been quite feminine in appearance, she would have liked to have tried to transition to be a boy. She was very kind of boyish and very tomboyish, even though she was quite feminine in appearance. So this is so basically Professor Ramachandran postulates in his paper for the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2007 that there's some kind of neurodevelopmental anomaly going on here, whereby the brains, the motor cortex, the mapping of the nerves has developed such that there is a model in the brain of a penis, even though they don't actually have one, because obviously the brain develops to map the physical body when it's in the, you know, fetal stages. So this is also, he then suggests that male to female transsexuals such as myself have a corresponding underdeveloped bit of neural mapping, so that for me, it always, to have a penis was like an alien thing. I always felt that it shouldn't have been there. It was like, for some strange reason, I couldn't understand. It just it just didn't feel like it was part of me. So this is Professor Ramachandran's main postulate, and there are others as well that I can go into later if necessary. But so this, for me, these kind of neurological evidences indicate that there is a genuine syndrome going on here that is not merely socially acquired. I've known people who have said, "Oh, well, you know, I used to know a young gay man who but who wanted to, you know, who thought that he wanted to be a girl, but actually he was actually gay. He just wanted to have gay relationships, and he eventually, fortunately, he backed out before he got too far down it, because I think he would have seriously regretted having gender reassignment surgery. So this is so you see, the gender critics, they want to prevent people like this young man going through gender reassignment, because it's not really what is right for them, and I'm perfectly fine with that, perfectly fine with it. The point is, they then go on and say that because some people make mistakes over this, some people aren't properly assessed, like they were when I went through my process 40 years ago, that the whole thing is wrong, that it should be banned, and so on and so forth. So I was expecting, sorry, this is going rather lengthy, but so I was basically expecting to be, if not have a mob outside my house, at least to be mobbed on the internet, on social media. And yet I've been absolutely staggered at how little response I've got, how even apparently people who have expressed the same kind of views as myself are reluctant to even share the links for my book and stuff. So I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled by this. I think basically this is something that we have. It is kind of like the world at the moment. I mean, I think we mentioned this previously beforehand, what you referred to. I think it's opinion alignment, where people have to, you know, you find that you might have one agreement with somebody on one thing, but then if you don't agree with them on everything else, suddenly you're the enemy, you know. And there are so many different subjects that we can all disagree on now in the modern world, that I really, you know, pointless to require people to agree on everything. I just really want to have a good debate with people on both sides, because it's quite clear to me that merely saying that you're a woman does not make you one. But I do believe that if you've had this kind of experience from childhood, and which is probably, I believe, based in some kind of neurological patterning, then that is at least the starting point to be able to go ahead and consider whether you could achieve this. So,
Well, I think that your book, it of course has met with silence, as you
yeah,
said, so it has
yeah,
been basically ignored. I think partially that's just a function of censorship on any kind of inconvenient truth. Another reason, I think, is that it requires people who are ideologically bound to a certain cause to actually inform themselves. Your book is scientific in nature, largely, and has a lot of information processing. It requires a lot of information processing for people. And I'd like to remind our audience that we are here speaking with a person who has not only personal experience with transitioning, but who has actually studied everything pertaining to it, and also from a philosophical point of view. And I think here our interests match,
mm,
because on first view, you might argue that the dissident right is a strange place for Mrs. Claire Randall to publish her books, because
yes,
she is touching a topic that is really controversial, namely transsexualism, transgenderism. On the other hand, I think it is an authentic topic that is very relevant to the subject, a very important subject for the dissident right, namely the question, the philosophical question of essentialism versus constructivism. Yeah, so you construct a reality or you assume it to be in essence. So this dilemma here is, of course, touched upon by the whole issue of transgenderism in a very precise way. And I would like to remind our audience that from a traditionalist point of view, so traditionalism is a school that's a little bit obscure, but it has formed the dissident right to a large extent. From a traditionalist point of view, in fact, from the point of view even of religious traditions, identity is not merely a given, it is a project. So any kind of authentic tradition would recognize identity to be a process that has to go through rigorous testing, rigorous living, rigorous performance in a certain way. So roles are not just merely coincidences, they are not choices, they are tests and requirements. So this fits in very well with how you look at the transgender issue. You say, so this requires an effort, it requires a step, and it requires tests, not only by the person of him or herself, but by the surroundings and also in a legal sense. So, of course, traditional systems, religious systems from the ancient world even onwards, they recognized that there are all kinds of transitions that have to be monitored and identities that have to be checked. So to become an adult from a child, there are all kinds of phases and rituals and initiations that you have to go through. To become a mother, the same. To become a wife, the same. Sacraments, rituals, they are bound up with these transitions. And this also applies to chosen transitions. So in the sense of, for example, somebody wants to be initiated in a mystery rite, or somebody that feels that he has a vocation to become a priest. There's a long transitional process. So recognition of transition processes, but in a very rigorous way, and upholding real identity was very essential in traditions. And I think this brings us here to the core of your book, I think, The War on Gender, which is that transgenderism has been weaponized, right? It has been weaponized by certain ideologues. As you say, it is now a mass phenomenon, which is hijacked by all kinds of interest groups. And you mentioned in one of your blogs a very interesting figure. If I correctly read it, it is like you assume that in the whole 20th century, between 1950 and the year 2000 approximately, the second half, there has been only something like 5,000 to 8,000 cases of real transsexual transitions. And I'm talking here about fully recognized and fully activated in the sense of physical measures and a checking process that has been undergone, and a very rigorous one at that. You have been one of these few, so this is a very marginal number. Which I find interesting, and you can comment on that, is that that number seems to be closely aligned to the natural occurring, let's say, liminal case amount. There is always, when people are born, there's the male and the female choice, but there is a very small group in between. That's liminal. We call it liminal. It's on the borderline, either physically or psychologically or both, in some kind of combination. And it seems that that percentage, which is minimal, which is really, really small, is something that is reflected in these figures.
Yes.
How does this relate to figures nowadays, after this, let's say, the Gender Act that has been passed in 2004? How does that relate, these figures? How do you explain that?
Well, so when the Gender Recognition Act was passed in 2004, it was expected that there were about 5,000 people at the time who had, in Britain, I'm talking about in Britain, obviously, that's the only place I can be really sure about, there had been about 5,000 people, and there were in the aftermath of the 2004 Act, when the processes had been set up in 2005, there were approximately that number who then applied to get recognition, people who had been through the medical process, most of them through the NHS, so they were, trackable. And then in the 20 years following that, there have been about another 3,000 or so. So, as you say, about 8,000. But what has also happened in that same time is that there's been a massive increase in people. In fact, this started a few years afterwards. It was around about 2012 that the massive increase started, and this is partly to do with the setting up of the Gender Identity Development Service by the Tavistock, who were subcontracted by the NHS to run this clinic. But it began with less than 100 children in the whole country in a year, I think. I forget the exact figures, but anyway, then by the end of the teens, it was up in the several thousand. So obviously there had been a massive, massive increase in applications. This is just with the children's treatment, minors. And a similar thing happened with the adult clinics, like the Becklin Clinic at Leeds, such that even adults are having waits of years before they can be seen. Now, I've actually corresponded with my MP about this, and he says that I simply couldn't understand this, because I said, well, look, we should really be more vetting, because there's been quite a few books come out over the last few years identifying that a lot of these, particularly young children, minors who started on these puberty blockers and treatments and stuff, haven't really gone through a full spectrum mental health assessment. A lot of them, there's a book by a lady called Hannah Barnes who examined the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service, and she spoke to some of the children who had backed out of the treatment, and some of them did benefit, but more seemed inappropriate, I would say. And this is one of the things which has been causing the backlash, because there's several things. First of all, there's the non-fully transitioned transgenders seeking access to women's spaces, and then there's also the excessive early treatment of young people. Now, the funny thing is that I actually, although these two things have happened at the same time, I find it quite bizarre, because on the one hand, the massive increase from 100 or so to several thousand referrals in 1 year, obviously you're getting a lot of children onto a probably irreversible medical pathway, and yet so yet at the same time, the transgender movement, and they call themselves a movement. I don't want to think of it as a movement. They think of it as a movement because a movement is a social movement. It's like, they want to have a change on society. I don't want societies, to change without its just own natural evolution. So the transgender lobby, they want people to be able to identify as women without having the early treatments that are being overly encouraged on teenagers. Now, I do find but these two things going on at the same time, I find very funny. I find it very funny indeed, because obviously they are contradictory, because you know, if what you want is what I wanted, then you would, you would try and fix yourself first. And I'm not trying to encourage, like aversion therapy or anything like that. But I went through a very, very, very deep psychotherapy myself, and this, I studied and I trained as a therapist. You have to go through your own therapy when you're doing this kind of thing. So it seems to me very strange that there are these two poles, which at the same time are being encouraged, but they're actually contradictory. Take me back to the thread, Alexander. So I've gone a bit off thread there, I think, a little bit, but
Well, what I was trying to find out from you is also something about the law case that you are involved with. You refer to the act that has been passed by the
yes.
British government,
Yeah.
2004.
Oh, yes.
You and other people have taken it upon yourself to criticize the effects of the act, because whatever its intentions, its formulation, it creates a situation in which, let's say, what you call performative identity is in fact more important than physical identity, and in which
Yes.
self-declaration is more important than
Yeah.
a tested transition. So
Yes.
if there is one prime example of, let's say, transgenderism as a war effort on identity itself, on gender identity, and so if there's one example of that, that would be that act. That act has actually perversely created a situation in which real transsexual cases of transsexuality are not recognized or are discriminated against even retroactively, rather than so LARPing, live action role playing, is more effective under the terms of that law than actual physical transitioning. I find it very remarkable. How is the status of that law case, and how is the reactions to the letters that you have sent to the parliament about this?
Right. Well, I'll just wrap up something for the previous section I was thinking about, which is that as to regards to the presence of somebody like me in what you recall the right, what was it, the dissident right, and the thing is, I do think that I do have a place there, because my work is based on trying to understand this condition scientifically, so that if it can be recognized, if it can be understood as a genuine neurological developmental problem, then I don't see that the right, the conservative right, the dissident right, whatever you want to call it, should object to something which is a real, genuine medical phenomenon that, right?
Agreed.
Yeah. But unfortunately, what happened with the 2004 Act is that while it was ostensibly intended to give formal legal reassignment rights to people such as myself who had gone through the full medical process and could prove it and so forth, unfortunately, and you'll have seen this in my blogs, David Lammy, who is now our foreign secretary, got very confused about whether people really required to have the medical surgical reassignment to be recognized. So they left this rather unfortunate loophole, which said that if somebody, for some reason, they had all got all the way to the point where they were ready to have the medical treatment, but they were told by their doctors that it would be threatening their life to take the hormones or to have an anesthetic, then they can still be recognized, even if they are still still have intact male anatomy. Now, this was seen as compassionate. Unfortunately, the left do everything on the basis of compassion, and they never have it. It's always about, you've got to give people everything they ask without formal assessment or standards on things is because that's intrusive, which, well, anyway, so this, unfortunately, and on the early social media that I was involved with around about that time, 2004, 2005, the post-operative transsexuals such as myself, we all agreed that having a law which allowed this loophole would lead to it being the case that people who not only had not been assessed, but also people who didn't even want to be assessed, but could simply, through this linguistic performative gender, which former associate of mine, Stephen Whittle, actually justified in a 2006 paper, which I quote in my blogs. And this is exactly what happened. The 2010 Equality Act, which seems to be the one that really put the cat amongst the pigeons around this, led to the just the notion of transgender being a protected characteristic. So this led to all sorts of confusion, which has caused, because obviously if someone is just self-identifying as transgender, then they are, may still be an have an intact male anatomy, but they want to be able to have the full rights and equalities of a natal woman. And even somebody such as myself acknowledges that there are certain places where it's just not suitable for a transsexual woman to be. For instance, the most obvious one is sports. Obviously, someone who's been through a male puberty may not have wanted to go through it. It may have been involuntary, and they may hate it. But the fact is, they nonetheless have gone through, any woman who took testosterone would be banned from the Olympics. So in a way, this is, it's only just acknowledging the state of affairs. So anyway, this became an increasing problem throughout the last decade. There was a lot of concern. There was the Cass report about the children or the young people, because there had been some people complaining. There has been a case taken to it, but I don't quite understand why. Unfortunately, she's had her case put back and not being acknowledged, even though it does seem to me that this was a young person who was inadvisedly encouraged to take medical treatment, and regrets it. So I think if you're a young person who takes medical treatment, which you regret on the advice of medics, then I'm sure that surely the medics are responsible. I can't see how you can get out of that one. But so anyway, what this has come to in the last year or so is that after I wrote a blog about this 2 or 3 years ago now. You may have come across the self-identification attempted in law in the Scottish Parliament. So the Scottish Parliament tried to pass an amendment to the Gender Recognition Act, which would allow people simply to identify with just a statutory declaration, and no medical transition involved. Now, this was actually, although I think this was passed by the Scottish Parliament, but it was rejected by the Westminster Parliament, because it went too far against the original 2004 Act. However, it does seem that gender activists continued pressing for this, and certainly there have been a number of street fights, between these, and people acting in an extremely unfeminine way, claiming to be women. But anyway, maybe that's gender stereotyping, but it's certainly something that the feminists have complained about. So this led to a group called For Women Scotland, and also Sex Matters was another national group. And J.K. Rowling, the famous author, donated £70,000 to these groups to take a case to the Supreme Court. To basically, their intention was to get the entire subject quashed, basically, so that this is the outcome, because basically the outcome of the thing about the case that they brought was to rule on the Equality Act primarily, because the Equality Act is really where the extreme vagueness comes in. And obviously I mean, the Equality Act is a very, very vexatious piece of legislation, because it's a good example of Orwell's statement from Animal Farm that everybody's equal, but some people are more equal than others. So people have more, certain people have protected status. So they don't, in this act, it doesn't distinguish between people who claim transgender self-identification and people like myself who have gone through the whole medical process, took 3, 4, 5 years nearly. So these groups, and funded by an extremely wealthy person, J.K. Rowling, who could afford basically to put any amount of money in. I mean, I believe she's now wealthy to the extent of billions. I mean, she could buy anything she wanted to. Anyway, unfortunately, this is one of the real big problems about the Supreme Court, is that they did not take any counter arguments. There was transsexuals and transgender people applied to give evidence. Obviously, the sort of evidence that's in my book as well about the kind of things like Professor Ramachandran, the other work that's been done over the last 20, 30 years. And they simply made a decision that in fact, even this decision is vague, and they claim that it gave clarity, but it does not, because they said, well, first of all, it should be the biological status is all that counts, right? But then it also says that this should be on the basis of your birth certificate. Well, obviously, there are people who have intersex conditions who are labeled as male or female at birth, but it then turns out later on that they are actually the opposite gender to what their apparent natal genital anatomy was. The controversial Olympic athlete Iman Khalif, who
Yes.
people may have heard of, she's been an extremely controversial figure. Now, it's not clear, because there's no formal statement about what medical condition she has, but it does appear that she has some form of intersex condition. It does appear that she probably has a male Y chromosome, and that she may have internal testes, which were perhaps undeveloped, undescended, or perhaps underdeveloped. Whether she had, if she has the very rare 5-alpha reductase deficiency anomaly, then it's quite probable, in fact, it seems almost certain, whatever her condition was, that she was born with apparent female genital anatomy. So obviously she would be assigned as girl at birth. Then it might have been discovered when she reached puberty that she wasn't having periods, so she will have probably been examined and found to have had some kind of intersex anomaly. But the point is that she's been brought up as a girl. She's always thought of herself as a girl. Now, it may be that because of her hormonal status, that she should be disqualified from participating in women's sports. However, that's just the result of the fact that she is an anomaly in, I always say anomalies in grey areas. But it may be that she should be not allowed to participate in women's sports because she has had the involuntary advantage of male hormones, which, if a ordinary female athlete were to take male hormones, of course, they would be disqualified. So even though it's involuntary. But the point is that people are saying that, oh, well, she's just a man. She's just a man, and that's how she should be. And they refer to her as he's a man, get over it, and everything else. This is completely failing to understand that there are anomalies and grey areas, and that the intersex conditions do exist, and not only physical intersex conditions such as Iman Khalif has, but also neurological intersex conditions, because I'm absolutely with Professor Ramachandran, because if I don't have a fully developed body map, which includes a penis, then it's no surprise that I felt that it was an alien part of my body, and that I now feel that my internal body map matches my external body map. So unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruling really makes none of these distinctions. It's extremely low resolution. And so this was then going to be sent to the apart from the fact there was no counter arguments allowed, there was also no appeal allowed. So it's a complete, well, I would call it a kangaroo court, really, because they had £70,000. It was paid for by a billionaire. The only people who were allowed to give evidence were people who were hostile, people who have admittedly been hostile to the whole concept of not just transgenderism, but transsexuals. And they actually say that they want, Helen Joyce, who is one of the leaders of the Sex Matters group, has actually said that she wants there to be fewer transsexuals. Now, she's not really been held to account as exactly what she means about this, but the way it's been taken by some is it's almost, not quite, but it's almost on the verge of kind of genocide. Like, these people should be eradicated. They shouldn't be allowed to do this. They must be stopped. They should be forced to detransition. And this kind of like, it's just gone completely too far. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission in our country, which is supposed to give guidance to the government on interpretation of law and interpretation of the judgment by the Supreme Court, have really refused to acknowledge any. It's basically they just say, look, anybody, your reassigned gender, because when I got my gender recognition certificate 20 years ago, I was given a new birth certificate. Now, this was controversial at the time because the birth certificate is supposed to be a unique document and so on and so forth. But this was done so as to provide privacy, so that people wouldn't be forced to, when they went for a job or something like that, they wouldn't be forced to out themselves. Because if somebody's gone through all this and if they're passing as a member of the desired sex, then I believe they should be treated as such, at least if they've, had the appropriate medical reassignment treatment. But this is completely rejected by them. And they even say there's probably the most strange thing that they have said is that while people are to be forbidden, so I am apparently to be forbidden from using a women's toilet, so they want me to use a men's toilet, right? Or if I was taken ill, to go into a men's ward in a hospital. But they then say that if somebody it looks inappropriate, then they shouldn't use either toilet. In other words, for instance, somebody who's a female to male transsexual who has probably had mastectomy, been taking male hormones so that they'd have probably a beard, probably have more muscular physique, quite possibly hair loss, such that they would, obviously with a female to male transsexual, the genital anatomy is more of a difficult medical procedure, but certainly a female to male transsexual that had all the hormonal treatment would look very much like a man. I mean, and they would be, so the Equality and Human Rights Commission has said that such a person, while they've said that people should use their birth facilities, if you've got a female to male transsexual who's got a beard and a bald head, then obviously he might be considered inappropriate using a woman's toilet. So they say, well, he can't use a men's toilet because he's basically a woman, as far as they're concerned. But at the same time, he can't use a men's toilet. He can't use a men's toilet because he's a woman. He can't use a woman's toilet because he looks like a man. So this is obviously, this is becoming very prejudicial. Now, my own view on this is that this is far too reductionist. This is far too reductionist. We need to be able to have a more subtle and nuanced idea of what makes a man or a woman than simply their Y or X chromosome, or perhaps how their anatomy appears at birth, because it can change. So I personally, my own view that I promote is what's known as whole person theory. And this is a bit of a complicated one, but it's basically treating people as a gestalt, so that we're not, you're not judging somebody on one particular feature. So you're assessing the entire person. Now, this theory was originally proposed by P.F. Strawson, Peter F. Strawson, who was the professor of metaphysics at Magdalen College, Oxford, and he probably knew C.S. Lewis, but that's just an interest for me. So that, now, obviously, professor of metaphysics at Magdalen College, Oxford is about the highest position you can get in academic philosophy, as far as I'm concerned, anyway. So, and what was the point of this whole person theory? He wasn't thinking about trans identity, although I do think it applies to that, because he was concerned, and I found this very interesting, because when I was finding out about him in the 1970s, an undergraduate, I was actually studying Descartes with Professor Peter Geach, who was probably the most highly rated Cartesian scholar of the 20th century. He was married to Elizabeth Anscombe, who was professor of metaphysics at Cambridge. I'm not sure which college, but anyway. And the problem that he was trying to deal with, which I found interesting studying Cartesian philosophy at the time, is that René Descartes set the foundations for modern science by separating mind and body. This Cartesian dualism. Now, this was not an absolute judgment. This was merely, so he merely did this because he said we can't understand how minds affect bodies, but we can understand how bodies work. In other words, material bodies, the kind of things that later Newton was to go on about, basically the laws of physics. And so he said, well, we don't really understand how mind works, how consciousness works. It's obviously, it's immaterial. It's not the same as matter, Galileo dropping weights off the top of the Pisa Tower and things like that. So we'll put consciousness aside. We'll just put consciousness aside for now, and we'll just concentrate on matter, physics and matter. So what Galileo and others had begun, Newton developed, and then all the others, and scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and everything. And here we are 400 years later after Descartes, and it's got so far down the materialist path that we now have philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, who, well, Richard Dawkins is a scientist, he's not a philosopher. It's basically saying that, well, mind, consciousness, it doesn't really exist. Now, this is not what Descartes said. Descartes just said, I don't understand it. We don't know how it works. We don't understand how it interacts with the body. So he put it on one side. But now I believe that we're getting to the point where we have to start doing something to reintegrate mind into body again. And this is what Professor Strawson was trying to do with his whole person theory. So he was saying, he was putting forward a radical kind of theory at the time, which was basically saying that we have to accept that living organisms, particularly humans, are more than simply mechanical robots, simply mechanical objects. We have consciousness, and this is something that is not found in the kind of automata that Descartes himself, created for the French king. He created water-powered robots for the, for the royal gardens. So, I think we're now actually at a stage where there's lots of interesting stuff coming up about relating to the scientific interaction of minds and bodies, because we have Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic field theory, which I think is very real and a very important part of this. And that would kind of work at the level of mind. And there's also a very recent thing, which I has only been developing in the last couple of years since my book came out, which is the new science of plasma consciousness, which is being put forward by Professor Robert Temple, who's an extremely unusual person, but he is a professor and he's written a whole lot of books, and most famous of which is The Sirius Mystery. And he has studied, he's gone deeply into plasma science, and there's recently been discovered that humans have, I saw a podcast just the other evening, and he showed how plasma channels have been found in the body corresponding to acupuncture meridians. So we're getting into a whole new kind of area of how consciousness and life works, right? So my postulate is that I have some kind of morphic field or, plasma field in my body, which is the life consciousness field that is all part of the integrated body system. That I mean, I know people will find, some people, reductionists, will find this, will just want to poo-poo this, but the fact is that this is a cutting edge development in science, and it absolutely matches the whole person theory hypothesis that Professor Strawson put forward 50, 60, 70 years ago, and which also I think matches my own understanding of how this works. So really simply reducing it to either a Y chromosome or a document that was written at your birth, it is really, it's just so low resolution that it's really not dealing with the issue. And it's the ultimate kind of goal of this seems to be to want to eradicate the concept of not just the linguistic performative gender, which I'm happy to dispense with, but that to actually dismiss even the possibility, or refuse to talk about it, because this is why I found that, I've just been silenced and ignored, is that I'm putting forward a neurodevelopmental hypothesis, and I think this is supported by the plasma body and the morphogenetic field, and possibly other theories as well. So Unfortunately, we've got a long way to go.
Well, this of course brings us to the
Oh,
cutting edge of science
mm,
and the cutting edge of thinking. They are coming to a point, I agree with you, the point that our fellow Arktos writer, colleague Jason Giorgiani has called
mm,
the
mm.
spectral revolution, the point at
Yes,
which
yes.
deterministic scientist approaches do not suffice to explain phenomena and do not suffice in the understanding of humanity on the individual level and a collective level. And I
Yes.
think it is actually quite funny because all this scientist approach, this materialist deterministic approach, is
Scientistic.
scientistic, yes. So a materialistic, deterministic frame. It has run its course to a certain extent. We are reaching the outer limits of that. At that point, there remain many questions and many issues that are unexplainable or do not permit manipulation through that model. And I think this point being reached is something that people do not feel comfortable with. It is not for nothing that Jason Giorgiani said spectral. He uses the word
Yes.
spectral. He can use the word eerie, spooky.
Yeah.
It makes people uncomfortable. And of course, the intersex connection, which exists as a physical connection, hermaphrodism is one part of it. And this condition spooks people. It makes people uncomfortable. It doesn't fit into narrowly delineated frames of understanding. But I think it's quite funny because ancient civilizations, ancient traditions have understood that there are always cases of liminality in any field
Yes.
of any field of human activity, of human existence. So it exists in the way somebody can be born outside of caste, for example, in the Hinduist system.
Yeah.
It can exist in the way that somebody can become Jewish instead of being born Jewish, as is recognized by Orthodox rabbis.
Yeah, but to do so, you have to go through a process. You don't just suddenly say,
process. Yes,
I'm a Jew and that's it.
You bring up a good point, because I believe we are now in a situation that performance and fraud, they are more forming the public awareness than essence and self-identification in a real sense. So we are here entering a realm in which fraud is in fact something that's perpetrated in many ways, not only in gender. So you can just be performative transsexual, as you said, but it is also found, for example, in the way nobility is being created by the British royal family without any adherence to traditional rules. So now you can become a lord or a lady based on how much money you have invested in Britain. Well, before you had to do something for that. You had to serve the crown in very specific ways. So there are many ways in which traditional identity is giving way to newfangled and not all too convincing identity constructs. But to come back to the Sheldrake equation, let's say that you talked about, this is a very interesting point. Of course, morphic fields, morphic resonances is something that in many traditions have been recognized, in the Hindu tradition, in all religious traditions. In fact, the identity of the soul is a project to be realized in this life, right? So everybody's soul is his personal project, and it needs to be, of course, regulated in the sense that there has to be a social pattern into which it is fitted, an identity category, there has to be laws to be kept, but that does not mean that the identity of the person itself is up for public debate. On the contrary, somebody who recognized the value of tradition was the German philosopher, up to Schopenhauer, and he said, you can criticize people's behavior, you can criticize people's social roles, but you cannot criticize somebody's identity. The moment that you do that, you create animosities that can never be resolved. And he was not a proponent of that. So the essence of somebody's being is probably best explained through what, in modern scientific terms, you can call it a morphic, a resonance or a morphic field in which somebody's identity fits, and that identity is only for that person to recognize. They're just outer points in which others can observe outside phenomena that fit to it, but maybe not even completely. And I think this is a very important point of the spectral revolution. The fact that people's identities are now, they must be recognized to be more than just materially deterministic. And I think that all this backlash that you are talking about is in fact a resistance against real progress. Progress in the sense of trying to think outside the box, trying to resolve issues by investigation rather than by legislation. And I think this is a very interesting field also from a traditionalist point of view. Traditionalist is, philosophy has always had my interest. And I think there the recognition of the morphic field is a given without even before Sheldrake invented it, because the term, it is just, let's say, an expression of the archetypes transplanted into human souls, right? This is a very important thing that I think we should keep aside from gender roles and gender and sexual preferences or legislation that surrounds it. I'd like to give you an example that I think is quite interesting for our audience from one of these traditions that's still alive, the Islamic tradition, as it is seen by the Jazari Madhab, that is one of the schools, jurisprudence schools of Islam. People, of course, associate that with the so-called Shia Islam. And it has been translated, this jurisprudence, partially into law in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And most people don't know that, but there, transgenderism is recognized. So people are allowed to change their gender. Of course, under very strict circumstances. That's not an easy process. It's like similar to what you went through. A multi-year process of scrutiny by doctors. It has to be done when you're adult. Declarations have to be signed. Family investigation is done. The intent has to be stated and restated. You're discouraged. Like, for example, somebody who is not Jewish is being discouraged from being Jewish. And then you have to commit to a physical transaction. Let's call it like that, a transition. That means surgery, hormone treatment, and all kinds of things attached to that. Quite similar, again, to what wannabe Jews go through, right? They have to have a circumcision and other things as well. So in the Islamic Republic of Iran, you can find many people that are in the process of such a transition. They are allowed to wear the clothing and they are supposed to live up to the gender roles of their chosen gender, of the gender that they feel comfortable with. But they have to commit. They have to say, okay, I'm waiting for an operation because there's a waiting list, for example. There's 2 years. They can live through their roles and they have access in the social realm to the facilities, but they're also expected to keep to the laws because, of course, their sexual roles and sexual gender roles are very well defined, and clothing habits and so on as well. I found that very interesting. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that, but I found that a very good example of how a traditionalist approach in fact comes closer to satisfying real birth identity. I'm talking about the Sheldrakean resonance identity rather than to a materially deterministic birth identity flatlined that has been assigned. Has been assigned and it has been legalized. I found it a very interesting example.
Well, I think it is very, very interesting that a supposedly quite conservative culture, traditional conservative culture, which is what people tend to think of as Iran, Shia, as being, is actually more open-minded to this than a lot of what is coming back in the West. And I think that the reason why we have this pushback, I mean, I've already kind of gone into this, is that it's been the self-identification has been kind of massively overdone in the West. And so there's been this backlash against it, whereas they've taken a more measured, like you say, traditionalist approach to this, because basically, and this kind of comes back to, you know, being on the dissident right, that if it is the case that transsexualism is a genuine neurological form of intersex, then we should be respecting it and accepting it, and then just finding the most the best ways to implement this, rather than what seems to me, I mean, it's kind of absolutely bizarre that the Supreme Court has done it's just the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they are, I mean, if people think that Iran is a reactionary over conservative government, well, what on earth is the Supreme Court doing? What I mean, it seems to me that you know, because it is the case that transsexual or transgender people have been accepted throughout history, and the Supreme Court is just incredibly regressive. I'm thinking about, say, for instance, as far back as the Roman era, there was a temple in Rome run by, they were known as the Galli. They were transsexuals or transgenders. Some of them may have even gone through, you know, what must have been a pretty extreme form of gender surgery, you know.
That's right, yes.
I mean, I'm extremely grateful for modern anesthetics and modern surgery and urology and all that kind of stuff, you know. But so to do that in the Roman period and to become a priestess of the Galli, you'd have to be pretty committed. I mean, I'd have probably gritted my teeth and done it, but you know. And then also in Thailand, you have the tradition for ladyboys, and you know, various other traditions throughout the world, basically very traditional cultures accepting that there are people with this gender indeterminacy, transsexualism, whatever, and they have found ways of integrating people into society with the existing structures of society, so that you're not forcing what they want to do. What the Supreme Court and what the Equality and Human Rights Committee want to do is they want to force people who are transsexual or transgender into displaying themselves, making themselves obvious in public, and which I think is really, they're just saying, oh well, we're just doing this to protect women's spaces. Well, if I'm forced to use a men's toilet, then I'm not being protected. You need to have as much protection for as many people as possible. And so whereas in Iran, it wouldn't be a problem.
No, it
Even
wouldn't
if
be an
somebody
issue.
knew, even if somebody knew. So it does show that different cultures have different standards, and that it's all very well to say we're so liberal here in the West, but actually I think it's becoming very unliberal in many ways. And I understand that it is necessary to pull back, you know, like all this treatment for minors and you know, people getting, you know, self-identification, all this. I do understand. I mean, this is the whole point of my book, and this is why I am excluded by both sides, because I will not concede to the gender activists who say all you need to do is say I'm a woman and then you are. And at the same time, but I want to defend my own position, and I do think I have a legitimate position. I do believe. I thought this, I mean, I knew I wanted to be a girl and I wanted to have the operation before I knew it was even possible. Before I'd even heard the word transsexual. At the age of 4.5, 5, I was already deciding I wanted to be a girl. And I never knew anybody or knew anything about it until I was about 10, when I read something in a newspaper. And it was quite coincidental. It was rather funny, actually. very Jungian synchronicity about this, because I remember when I was about 10, I can't be sure, but I was in the school library and I was reading a newspaper. It's probably the Daily Telegraph. And I was reading about the first time I'd read in my life about somebody had had a transsexual operation reassignment. And I was just reading that and thinking, wow, this is amazing. There's hope for me, maybe one day. And at that very moment, there was a boy who was in some conversation with somebody else in the other part of the room that I wasn't listening to, but I heard him say, that's as unlikely, or that's as impossible as a man becoming a woman. So I said, well, actually, look at this newspaper. And they all went, oh gosh, ooh. So that was quite interesting. But the point I'm trying to say is that this was never something that was socially inculcated into me, or it was it was always something that was, as you say, an essential part of me. It was programmed into my very neurology, and I've never regretted it, and I've always felt comfortable with it, and it's just always been just I kind of look back on my life now, and I kind of think, well, this was like inevitable. This is what I had to do. This was my life destiny, and it's not merely for my own, personal gratification, because now I find myself in a position where I'm actually, taking a position on this, on the internet. And so there is actually some purpose of this way beyond just me, satisfying my own self-image.
Well, in this Jafari school of Islamic thought, of course, there is quite important usul fiqh. It's a root of jurisprudence, which is called ijtihad. It means actually something simply like using your brain, using discernment. And it means that problems need to be addressed not only on the basis of rules, they also should be assessed such, but they should also be arranged, they should be thought through. And so people can be punished on the basis of not sticking to a gender role. They can be punished on the basis of sexual perversion or sexual deviancy, but they cannot be persecuted and punished on the basis of who they are. So I think this is a very important distinction to make, because in the West, there is this blurring of the lines. It is like sexual preference and gender roles are one and the same as underlying identity, as a given identity. It is like this identity is being blurred along with norms, alongside standards and roles that existed before. And I'm always wondering about that. Is that just a negative? Is that process of that blurring, is that just let's say weaponized by certain interest group, as you have proven in your work? There are definitely interest groups that like to weaponize this issue, undermine roles, gender roles, identity, and make it a kind of let's say political force as well. But I think there's also another aspect that has been touched upon by our colleague Jason Georgiani, and I would like to bring that up. He presupposes that there is a overall development through which humanity is going as a whole. So, and of course, it is well known in ancient myth that before human used to be male and female, they used to be one. There used to be an androgyne. And of course, in certain literature and in certain art forms, this has been aspired to by modern artists, modern writers. Himself, Jason Georgiani, has written about this. And it is like an ancient longing to be more than divided into a gender. Now, of course, the present human condition doesn't allow us to experience it, but in artistry and in philosophy and in, let's say, in writing, this, of course, are thought experiments that people can preoccupy themselves with. Do you think that this preoccupation with transgenderism, completely aside from the fact that there is such a thing as a real transsexual identity, do you think that this larger cultural preoccupation, it is going in a certain direction? What is it? What do you associate with it? How do you see that? Because you have had a time of many decades to look at this social phenomenon. How do you look at it?
Oh, well, that's quite a big question. Well, obviously, just at a sort of social and mechanical economic level, the the presence of industrialization and so on and so forth does kind of make the division of labor less extreme. So I think that, and also women are finding that they can do many of the things that men can do, and so on and so forth. Whereas at the same time, though, obviously it is necessary to maintain a certain amount of gender distinctions merely for biological reproduction and so forth. So I think we are moving towards a more kind of androgynous level of personality, but I don't think that we're ready to go to a position because we are we are stuck in our bodies. So I think that while I think it's useful and valuable for people to be able to take some element of the opposite gender into their own personality, at the same time, I think it is necessary to have this kind of biological polarity. But I mean, I'm very, very sad that here in the West, that the enforcement of the biological distinctions actually being taken further rather than having the rough edges taken away from them. So I think that's and I mean, I was just thinking that for instance, in traditional cultures, not just the Shia culture, but there are all sorts of birth anomalies whereby transsexuals in some cultures will be outcasts, but in other cultures they will be treated as shamans. And just as in India, for instance, conjoined twins, Siamese twins,
Yes.
they are treated as almost like divine incarnations, whereas other cultures might leave them on a hillside to die, because
I think
they,
you're very right. Anomalies, they are sacred in many cultures, and
yes, yeah,
it's quite interesting to look at how different cultures treat them. But one common line, common element is always there, and that is that in certain functions there are gender reversals. It is like in the Catholic Church, traditional Catholics, the woman wear a skirt, so does the priest.
yeah,
And so women give birth, but the priest is celibate. There are kind of polar oppositions that are being played with, and that you can see this recurring process if you study cultural anthropology in many cultures. And this playing with polarity, of course, is very regimented. It has certain channels through which it is done. But I believe that is it's very valuable for societies to work with this polarity. So the presupposition
yes,
of the
yeah,
polarity should not be, there should be no questions about it. And that is the danger, of course, that we face in the West, that this polarity itself is being diminished. Like Julius Evola, he always said, when he walked through the streets of Rome, or in his wheelchair rather, or he looked out of his window, he sees women start to resemble men, and also men start to resemble women. He found that very scary. That this
Sorry,
polarity.
who was this?
Julius Evola. So he is one of
Oh,
the
Evola,
great,
yes, yeah,
yeah, he's one of the great traditionalist thinkers,
yeah,
and he saw this in his lifetime.
mm,
So that the polarity was diminishing, and he found this very scary because he he was of the opinion that these experiments with polarity, socially embedded and privately, of course, behind closed doors, are really, really important, because without this, no progress is possible in any sense. And I think you brought up a very good point. You said we have to preserve it, the biological reproduction aspect of it. But what you see with people in the West is as well that the biological reproduction is, for all kinds of reasons, falling. And the polarity is disappearing at the same time as the reproduction rates are going down. It's like a magnet losing its power. And I
Yes.
think this is
Yes.
a very, very scary process. Of course, that has been weaponized to a certain extent and is being used by certain interest groups. There's no doubt about that. But also there seems to be some autonomous process at work here. It's like the polarity underpinning the culture is to a certain extent disappearing, which I find it very regrettable, and it's
Yeah.
very it is not aesthetic, and
No.
it's very, but on the other hand, it is a fact. It's a fact that we are living with. How do you look at that?
Well, I mean, I think it is unfortunate, and I think that it is. I think that it is well, back to this weaponized kind of idea, because I think some of it is from people who want to, make the West, bring down the West, or make it more compliant to uh, other kind of ideologies. Um, um, I just I think, yeah, it's so difficult. I don't want. I would say for myself, I don't want to. I've never wanted to change concepts of gender or sex. Because it seems to me that we see one of the things is you hear about, like I was saying earlier, the transgender movement. Well, people who are in the transgender movement, they want to. I mean, one of the director of gender studies at the Leeds department some time ago. She's moved now, but she said that I was on her mailing list, and the mailing list at one point she wrote an email and she said that she thought that not only gender but sex was merely a social construction. And so if something's just a social construction, then it's subject to being, changed, different social values. And I completely disagree with this. I mean, that gender is the application of kind of innate polarity to social conditions. But if you're trying to not only modify but eradicate, this is what they want to do, because basically saying that sex is only a social construct, it's making the entire thing into it's all mutable, it's all changeable. There's no essences to it, and there was a word you used earlier, but it's trying to get away from. I think that I've actually seen kind of radical transgenderists talk about how the whole concept of sex and gender is oppressive, and it's like, how can you possibly say? It's like saying, reality is oppressive. Well, reality is just reality. We have to live with these things, and people might say, well, your reality was to be born as a boy. Well, yeah, but the thing is, you can change some things, but it's only within my remit. It's only my life. I'm not trying to change the broad spectrum of society, I wanted to fit into society as a girl, as a woman. And that's how I've hopefully managed to to do it. I have not in any way tried to change social values around women and men. I think that that is the that is what some of these some of the transgender movement people are trying to do, and it just seems to me to be missing the point. They're just unhappy with their life, so that they're unhappy with social circumstances, so they want to change it. But they're not. It's not. But they're trying to change the outside, the world, when they should just be wanting to adjust themselves. Because there's so many things in the world that you just have to accept, and
Well,
you're
you,
you're the only person you can really change for yourself.
this is, of course, a very dissident right point of view. Get real, get tough, man up, face reality. I think that's very true. And of course, the preciousness of identity realized in life, that means not just being what you're supposed to be born with, but living up to all the
Mm, mm,
requirements
mm.
and adjusting yourself accordingly. That is quite a challenge, should be quite a challenge for everybody. And the preciousness of it should not be underestimated. So a true nobility is something else than somebody who's just been given a title by a queen on the basis of his income. Um,
Uh,
and of course, gender requires the same. To be a man is also more than just being born biologically with certain attributes. And so is it
exactly.
to be a woman. So these things are very, very precious in themselves. And the realization of
Mm,
these projects, life projects, they are so precious, they're almost beyond expression.
mm,
And
mm,
I think
mm.
you reminded our audience of that in a very thorough way, I think, in this interview. I advise everybody to buy the book. It's out with Arktos, of course. Claire Rae Randall, The War on Gender. I think it is an obligatory read for anybody that wants to say anything intelligent on the subject.
Well, thank
And
you.
I thank you very much for having joined me in this interview. And I hope that people support you. I certainly encourage them not only to buy the book, but to read your Substack and support in any kind of way possible. All kinds of links will be provided in the podcast, fixed links. And just in this case, I would like to give you the last word, Claire.
Um, apart from thank you very much indeed, Alexander, for having to invite me and have such an interesting conversation. And I'm just so grateful to be able to talk about these things in a deeper philosophical context. And we've been able to, you've really helped me, cover some of these more deeper philosophical topics, which are basically just not addressed. They're very, very simplistic, reductionist,
Mhm.
social
Yes.
determinist views that are so, it's like they were out of date 50 years ago, but they're completely inappropriate now. And
Right.
unfortunately, we're being subjected to them from both sides. I mean, I'm absolutely staggered that so little of this debate has really moved on. That I see the same subjects, the same points being raised now as I saw being raised in the 70s and 80s when I was dealing with this myself. So I think it's really important that we have a wider view on this, that we consider the more
Mhm.
philosophical issues around this, that the whole concept of the philosophy of personhood is something
Mhm.
that is really, really important, and something which, frankly, it's just outside of the box for most people, and it's very, very sad to me that people aren't willing to, see the larger picture, that this is a complex issue, and that it's basically something that different political factions are trying to control, and that
Mhm.
if we're really going to be concerned about, people, um, and you know achieving self-actualization. I mean, this is
Mhm.
something I wanted to mention because this is was something I studied a lot about when I was at university. Abraham Maslow's concept of self-actualization. What on earth does it mean? Well, it means going through the process to fully externalize your, your inner personality that is merely potential for most people. Now, obviously, for me, it was a bit unusual, but I think people aren't really generally, they don't kind of think in terms of personal development. And I've seen my whole life in terms of personal development. This has all been one big personal development issue to become myself. And I think people should be more willing to be open-minded about this. And as you've said, if traditional cultures consider this, then, shouldn't our more supposedly, advanced Western cultures be actually looking at this in a more sensitive and humane and nuanced way?
Well, on this point, I would like to thank you very much. I like to thank our audience for their time, and I say to you goodbye.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you.